Chapter 5. On September 15th, 1916, the tanks made their debut in the war. They were a complete surprise. No secret of the war was better kept. I knew that for certain, because although we had vague hints from our agents in England that the British were preparing some new weapons, not all the efforts of the German Secret Service had been able to penetrate the mystery. The only reports of the slightest value that we received were from one agent who said that the English had invented some machine which could cut barbed wire. He could discover no details, however, and had evidently supplied them out of his own imagination. He described a sort of mechanical rabbit which would crawl across no man's land and cut the wire by some unspecified method. Of the 49 tanks available for duty on that famous day, one of the landmarks in the history of the war and of warfare, only 9 actually succeeded in fulfilling their mission, and as we knew then what a tremendous effect they had, immediately discussion arose: ought the secret to have been exposed for such comparatively puny gains? If 9 tanks could accomplish so much, what would have been the effect of 900, and so on? The debate continues until this day. While there is a lot to be said for dealing the Germans every possible blow as the opportunity afforded, and while there is something to be said for the necessity of trying out the tanks under actual war conditions, in my mind there is no doubt whatsoever that had we kept the secret a little longer until a few hundred tanks were available, then we might have unloosed them in one stroke which might have been decisive. As I have said, military experts and others have debated this question almost ad nauseum, but there is one query that you will find running through their discussion. How was it that the Germans, thus forewarned by the introduction of a mere sprinkling of tanks, took no effective countermeasures? How could they thus be so thoroughly surprised at Cambrai over a year later? I don't think that any of the debaters have yet succeeded in supplying the right answer to that very pertinent question, but I think that what I have to say will be of considerable interest to them. During the summer of 1916, momentous changes took place in the German High Command, changes which were destined to have a considerable effect upon my position and upon my chances of doing useful work for England. I remember one August morning when Colonel Nicolai burst into my office and ordered me to pack my kit at once, preparatory to going to the Eastern Front. I was astounded. I could think of no reason why I should go to the Eastern Front. I spoke no Russian. Of what use could I be on the intelligence staff there? I asked. I did not mention, of course, that to go to the Russian front meant that my usefulness would naturally drop by about 80%. But he had no time to argue with me. He simply gave orders, stating that I would receive full instructions when actually on the train. He also gave me full details of documents which I was to take with me. With his usual thoroughness, he had already had them sorted out ready for me. Consequently, a few hours later, I found myself rolling eastward. In the train with me were 3 or 4 officers from General Headquarters, most of them considerably senior to me. It was a conversation with them that I found out the purport of our mission. Apparently, General von Falkenhayn, the Chief of Staff of the German Army, and virtually therefore the Commander-in-Chief, was almost in disgrace. The Kaiser had now lost confidence in him. I remember noticing from some of the English newspapers of the time that his fall was attributed to the British victory on the Somme. This, however, is not the case. Falkenhayn fell not because of the Somme, where, as we found to our cost, the German defense was better than excellent, but because of his failure at Verdun. If Falkenhayn were dismissed, there could only be one alternative commander, Hindenburg, whose fame resounded throughout Germany as the victor of Tannenberg. Of course we knew very well that Hindenburg meant Ludendorff, though I doubt if at that time more than one German in 3 had ever heard of Ludendorff's name. Thus the purpose of our journey became obvious. Hindenburg and Ludendorff would be coming to General Headquarters in a few days' time, as soon as they had been able to hand over the command of the Russian front. Naturally, they wanted full details about the position in the West, and consequently we, representing all sections of GHQ organization, were to go to Russia at their disposal, and probably to travel back with them a week later. Had I any doubts before about the relative position of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they were immediately dispelled on arrival. Hindenburg received us collectively and in most friendly fashion, taking us in to dinner immediately. But when we got down to real business, it was Ludendorff who took us into his office, received our reports, and cross-examined us at great length. My own interview with him lasted over 3 hours. I was at great pains to appear at my best, for naturally I wanted to impress him very favorably. It was not very often that a junior officer got such an opportunity. Subsequent events proved that I succeeded fairly well. I saw Ludendorff many times during the succeeding days, and during the journey back across Germany. He was always very civil to me, but we never became friendly. There was too big a gap in our rank, and Ludendorff was a German officer before everything else. With Hindenburg, things were vastly different. I grew to be very fond of this rather portly old gentleman, who had no military genius, but a tremendous amount of moral character. Yet it was seldom that Hindenburg asked me questions about my job. All the practical side was dealt with by Ludendorff. In passing, I ought to say that Ludendorff made the greatest mistake of his life when he left Hoffmann on the Russian front. I notice that today the keenest military students are proclaiming with justice that Hoffmann, of all commanders during the war, was the only one to show real signs of military genius. That was my impression at the time, although I only saw him for a few days. A keener brain I have never yet met in my life. While it is true that the conditions on the Eastern Front could not be compared with those prevailing in the West, where Germany was confronted, not with ill-armed and ignorant levies, but with the powerful and well-equipped armies of England and France, yet I was glad for our sake that he was left behind. From the German point of view, however, it was a disaster. I fancied from conversation I heard that Ludendorff was just a little bit jealous of the brilliance of his junior. Maybe he could not forget those dispositions made before Tannenberg. Maybe he knew that when historians came to look things up and work things out, they might give the credit of that great victory not to Ludendorff or to Hindenburg, but to Hoffmann. However that may be, Hoffmann was left behind and given the important position of Chief of Staff to the commander on the Russian front. The coming of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, or H, as I.C. Winston Churchill rather aptly describes, the combination of character and brain, meant a great difference to the status of the intelligence staff at General Headquarters. Not that we had ever had any reason to complain. For that matter, we were certainly held in higher esteem, far higher esteem than our opposite numbers on the British staff. But Ludendorff was a man who depended tremendously on accurate intelligence, nor did he believe in talking only to the chief. It was fortunate for me that Colonel Nicolai was not a jealous man, and raised no objection whatsoever when Ludendorff consulted me directly on one or two points, with which I was specially qualified to deal, that is to say, the organization of the British Army, which I had made my pet study. So he asked me a good many questions about the tanks. I will not use the German word, which occupies about a line and a half of type. We were to do everything possible, of course, to obtain full particulars of these machines and the details of their construction. Ludendorff did not seem to be vastly perturbed after all. The tanks had only appeared in small numbers, and very few of the Germans who saw them had come back alive to spread panic reports. Nevertheless, it was essential that we, that is to say Ludendorff, should know more about this new factor in warfare, however insignificant it might be. Naturally, therefore, our agents in England were sent urgent instructions that they were to try and get hold of plans and constructional details of the tank. I sent off the letters in code, and by roundabout routes, with a cheerful heart, never believing for one moment that any of them would succeed. I even sent over 2 or 3 special men with the same object in view. I reported this as proof of my energy in the matter. It could hardly be taken as being my fault that all the men I sent over were arrested before they had the chance of doing anything. It is at this stage that I have to report one of my failures, that such were comparatively rare throughout the whole of the war, was not due to my ability, but to the foolproof nature of my position. But one morning, to my amazement, I found in the post, addressed personally to Colonel Nicolai, a letter from one of our agents in England, enclosing a full set of blueprints, covering apparently the essential parts of tank construction. I was flabbergasted. It was only the happy accident of Colonel Nicolai being on leave for a few days that had brought these into my possession. Otherwise, the secret must inevitably have been given away to the Germans, who would be able to construct tanks ad lib. I had to take a chance. I was not aware whether anyone else had seen this letter, which was fairly bulky, and which had come into headquarters through Holland, but I didn't care. Within 10 minutes of the plans being received, they were destroyed. If any questions were asked, I would have to think out some excuse. They must have been lost somewhere or other, and I had never seen them at all. For several days I was very worried about the whole affair. Surely the agent would write in again, probably claiming payment for his wonderful scoop. I might find it very, very awkward to tell the necessary tale. But I need not have bothered. A week later I had a note from Mason, who, having been rather nastily wounded during the previous winter, had now a staff job at the War Office, where he was working under General Cockerill of the Special Intelligence Section. He had found a method of getting in touch with me through a Belgian merchant at Liège. It had been agreed that this method should only be used at the rarest of intervals, although the risk of detection appeared infinitesimal. I did not wish to risk my position for trifling thing. Mason's letter was a trifle apparently. It was not really wise judgment on his part, but his sense of humor was so strong that he could not resist it. The only pity was that his postal method took a week longer to reach me than did the plans sent by the German agent. "A great joke," wrote Mason. "We ran down one of your agents who was trying in most childish fashion to obtain plans of our new tanks. Well, he's got them, we've seen to that. They will probably arrive with you any day. I only hope the Germans spend a few £1,000,000 building tanks to the specification your man has got, and then you can have the pleasure of watching their faces when they find that the tanks won't go." Yes, it was a great joke. I would certainly have longed to see the faces of the responsible Germans on such an occasion. Unfortunately, I had destroyed the plans a week before. I suppose I ought to have had more confidence in the authorities at home, although a good many people who knew our administration during the war will forgive me for my error of judgment. Nevertheless, I was very annoyed with myself. Here was a chance of completely misleading the Germans, and in my haste I had destroyed it. Why had I not kept those plans instead of ripping them up and burning them? I walked round my room, vainly endeavoring to kick myself. Consequently, when a fortnight later an opportunity arrived to retrieve my lost reputation, I seized it with both hands. It was Ludendorff's suggestion. He sent for me one morning and asked if I had been able to get the details of the tanks for which he had asked. I had to confess failure. Furious with myself all the while, I had no need to point out to him the difficulties. He knew them well enough, but at the end he threw out a gentle hint. It was obviously almost vital that we should know more about these machines, and well, he said, no more, but without waiting for him to conclude his sentence, if ever he meant to, I at once suggested that I should go to England myself in a desperate effort to do something drastic. So once again, I crossed to England. It was one of the most annoying moments in my life when I had to confess to Mason that I had ruined his pretty little scheme. "Now," I said, "we must think out something just as good, or even more effective." "What about these tanks?" I asked. "What are they like?" For remember, I had not even seen one, although on Colonel Nicolai's orders I had made a journey to the Somme to see if it would be possible to organize an attack to recapture flares together with the derelict tanks lying about the valley. But the local commander had assured me with reason that the possibility of success of such a counterattack was precisely nil. The only glimpse of a tank I had had was from an airplane a good many 100 feet up above, which meant that I had seen nothing at all. So I plied Mason with questions, and he gave me all the information he had. But it doesn't seem that they are much good, he said. GHQ have reported very strongly against them. What? I cried. But that's absurd. I understand that only a few were in action on September 15th, and they certainly did a terrific lot of damage. Well, he continued, I know that's the position. Forbes told me a long report has been received from GHQ calling the tanks complete failures and worse. Why? I know that we had an order for 1,000 of them placed with the Ministry of Munitions, and this report recommends that the order should be cancelled, which I believe has already been done. However, let's have Forbes in and talk to him. Instead, at my suggestion, we went round to Forbes' room. If possible, I wanted to see that report myself. I did. It certainly damned the tanks right and left. They were inefficient and useless, it said, to the extent of several thousand words. It finished up by proposing the complete abandonment of the tank program. The War Office had indeed accepted this report and had placed a cancellation on the Ministry of Munitions. It was a lucky chance for England, Forbes explained, that the officer in charge of the tank department of the Ministry of Munitions was a temporary soldier, Major Albert Stern, a well-known city man. Who was not subject to the disciplinary fear which might have daunted a regular soldier. When he received the order of cancellation, he refused to accept it, and went direct over the head of his superior to Mr. Lloyd George, who was then Minister of War, and having made certain of Mr. Lloyd George's opposition to the cancellation, he coolly informed the War Office that he was not prepared to accept it. Needless to say, Major Stern received the reward of his invaluable action, for at the earliest possible opportunity he was relieved of his post, and the control of the tank department was given to an admiral who had never seen a tank in his life. This was the way in which England muddled through. This was the intriguing story which Forbes told, but even before he had finished, an idea was already running through my brain. A copy of this report was all I needed. Better still, the original, signed by the very highly placed officer at General Headquarters. If I could get hold of that and take it back to Germany, then surely I would have made amends for my previous error. For with this report in his hands, Ludendorff would certainly dismiss the tank as a total failure. He would be more than surprised when, the 1,000 tanks program having materialized, the great land battleships again returned to the charge. I put the idea to Forbes and Mason, who enthusiastically agreed. It was necessary, of course, to consult their superior officers, but as I have suggested before, I think not every officer at the War Office was a fool. There were a great many of the biggest brains in England working there. The trouble was that only too seldom were they given a chance. However, no one would ever accuse Major General Cockerill of lack of intelligence or vision, and he readily agreed to the scheme which I put forward. I would have liked to have seen Colonel Nicolai's face when he received my letter asking that I should be supplied immediately with a fully qualified burglar. I had to wait a fortnight before the man arrived, which I put in at home in a welcome spell of leave. Then I got into touch with another of our agents in England, a Dutch Jew who had been living in London since well before the war, quite unsuspected by anybody. I informed him that I should need his help. He demurred. He was merely a postman, he said. His job was to send on communications, not to take any active part, but I insisted, and under a threat of exposing him to the British authorities, he agreed to come in. When my burglar arrived, he was a Swiss actually, who was officially classed as a watchmaker. I was ready for action. I had arranged with Forbes and Mason that the original document should be stored in the London house of the assistant to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. On the night I named, the family were all to go out together. There would be left in the house a butler, a footman, a cook, and 2 maids. These people knew nothing whatsoever of our plan. It was essential that everything should appear to be done in genuine fashion. It was a typical November night, as a car skimmed through Hyde Park towards Kensington. Driving the car was the Dutchman, disguised as a chauffeur. His job was to keep a sharp lookout, and to warn us by tooting on his horn should any danger threaten. The burglar and I proceeded to enter the house. It was an easy job. There are few houses that even an amateur housebreaker cannot enter if he wants to, and within a few minutes we had gained access to the basement. Then the fun began. First, in the hall, we surprised the footman, and I can still remember his look of childlike amazement when he looked up from his newspaper to find 2 revolvers pointing at him. We did not give him a chance to speak. In a couple of minutes he was gagged, bound, and placed inside an adjoining room. One of the maids was the second victim, but unfortunately she did manage to throw a scream before being overpowered. In charged the butler, an old man, but game for all that. Ignoring our revolvers, he dashed towards the telephone, and we had a terrific struggle with him. In fact, we had to lay the poor old chap right out before he would give in. The other women, of course, were easy work. The whole episode so far had taken less than 10 minutes, which was just as well, for when we examined the safe in which the document was stored, my burglar friend announced that it would take him a good hour to get it open. So he got busy with his blowpipe. I alternately took a walk round the house to see that everybody was still helpless, and then returned to watch the burglar at work, which I may say was rather interesting. In a little more than his scheduled time, like all really good workmen, he had got through the steel lining of the safe. His hand was inside, and soon he was pulling out a bundle of documents. I searched through them. It was rather important that I should do that, for he would make an invaluable witness for me should anything be questioned. A lot of them I put on one side as personal papers, but at last I gave a subdued whoop of joy and waved the little bundle of documents in the air. Here it was, I announced to him, a report on the tanks, together with a bundle of photographs. Oh yes, our boss would be very pleased with us, and would doubtless express gratitude in a financial form. The burglar grinned. He of course had done the whole job for a fee, a very high fee at that. A few minutes later we were outside in the car, being driven back to our hide, which was not in East London, but in a West End hotel. The Dutchman was mighty pleased to be out of it all, particularly when he saw the reports the next day, for the papers hinted very openly about vital documents being missing from the Kensington house. Some of them even added leaders about criminal carelessness of army chiefs, and so on. I took copies of these newspapers back with me when a day later I sailed for Holland. My Swiss clockmaker was actually on the same boat, but traveled quite separately. I felt very happy. Of the impression that report would make, I had no doubt, although I had no plans. I had a whole series of photographs of the tanks. These actually were interesting but quite valueless. The main secrets of the tank were 1. The powerful motor operating in so confined a space. 2. The armor, which had been specially designed by Admiralty experts to resist considerable force without being overwhelmingly heavy. Assuredly, not a scrap of information on these 2 points would be gained from a year's perusal of the photographs. In any case, as the result of the tryout on the Somme, the design of tank was being very drastically altered, and the new production would be vastly different from those 9 pioneers which waddled into the battered streets of Flers. Again, I need hardly describe my reception on my return. My chief shook my hand, and even Ludersdorf's unemotional face exhibited some hint of excitement. He said very little to me. He was not a man to throw compliments about, but he was very obviously pleased, and so was I, for I had come to the conclusion that I ought now to get myself transferred to the operations side of GHQ. There I would be, in the inner circle, so to speak. There I would get Ludendorff's intentions at first hand, and not through the all-unconscious Amur, now a bosom friend. Chapter 6. Among the throng of refugees who poured into England from Belgium in August 1914 was a young girl named Hortense Jourdains from Antwerp. After a period in the care of the Relief Committee, she had found a position as a sewing maid to a lady living in a country house near Guildford. Early in February 1917, however, she was astonished to get a letter bearing the Brussels postmark, written in a typical continental handwriting, but nevertheless from some person of whom she had never heard. In fact, the whole letter was a strange and confusing medley of things she knew nothing about. The first 2 closely written pages were a mass of family detail, inquiry after so-and-so and so-and-so, refugees in England, then a series of snippets about those left behind in Belgium, how so-and-so had died, so-and-so had had a baby, so-and-so was expecting one, and the like. In the last paragraph, tucked away in a maze of this chit-chat, was a short note saying that the family had decided to return to Cumbria, as it seemed to be quite safe there now. They would return, they expected, about the middle of March, and hoped to settle down nicely without hindrance from anyone. The German censor had of course opened the letter, but had seen nothing to attract his attention. The girl would probably have ripped the letter up, had she not been warned some months before that if ever she received a letter which she did not understand, she was to hand it to her mistress. This she did, and within a few hours the letter was in the hands of Mason at the War Office, for the girl's mistress was the mother of Mason's wife, and I had arranged such a scheme of communication with him on the occasion of my last visit to England. Mason spent many hours on the letter, reading it from every point of view. He knew, of course, that it was from me, and he knew that it contained a message. He was a little puzzled as to where the message would be hidden. At last, however, by a process of elimination, he concentrated on the vital sentence. By this time, the battle on the Somme was ended. At the cost of nearly 500,000 men, we had wrested a few square miles of ground from the gallant German defenders. The expectation was that the battle would reopen in the spring, when fresh attacks would perhaps capture a few more square miles of comparatively unimportant ground. Though the ground might be unimportant, it was argued this was a war of attrition. We were forcing the Germans to fight, for though our casualties were high in attacking, theirs were higher in defending. That was the argument. It was by no means accurately founded. Actually, the German casualties were only something like half our own, but the Allied command gave no heed to the great change which had come over the German war direction. No longer was the cautious Falkenhayn in charge. Instead, there was now the victorious Hindenburg-Ludendorff combination, straight from its triumphs on the Eastern Front. Now, one of the greatest differences between the war in the West and the war in the East was that of movement. In the West, if either side advanced a mile, it could claim a considerable victory, whereas in the East it was quite common for armies to move backwards and forwards, not 1 mile, but 50 or 100. It is strange that neither the British nor the French command ever thought that a German general would deliberately give up ground of his own accord. They would certainly never have thought of doing such a thing themselves, but Ludendorff was not one of those men who worshipped ground unless that ground had some purpose. Driven from the strongest of his positions on the Somme, he was in no mood to continue the fight where accident had left it when winter closed down the hostilities. No, he argued, let it be transferred to a ground of our own choosing. There was more than that in his scheme, too. He knew very well that the Allies were preparing an offensive on a tremendous scale for the spring. It was reasonably certain that a portion of it at least would fall along the disputed territory of the Somme. Very well, he argued again, let us evacuate this sector. Then the whole of the weeks and months of preparation will be lost. If they want their offensive, they will have to mount a fresh attack. They will probably hurry over it in an endeavor to keep the scheduled dates, and it will be a very haphazard affair. That was his argument, as he put it to his staff, and the world knows how sound it was. Consequently, when on March 12, 1917, British patrols moved out in front of their line, their curiosity excited by the lack of movement opposite to them, they found that the Germans had gone. Only ruined villages and devastated fields were left behind. The main German army covering this sector was already safely ensconced in the new Hindenburg Line, as the British called it, or the Siegfried Line, as it was officially termed. This was the maneuver of which I had of course known weeks before, and of which I had warned Mason in my letter. If you will look on the map, you will find that the Hindenburg Line runs just in front of Cambrai. So my hints about moving about Cambrai and about being safer there were quite enough to give Mason the strongest of hints. There were already other indications available at General Headquarters, but not yet communicated to the War Office. Our airmen flying over the German lines had reported activity along the arc of the Lens-Noyon salient. Several of our agents behind the German lines had reported the mobilization of French and Belgian civilian labor, together with Russian prisoners of war, for gigantic earthworks in the same area. My own report, coming on top of all the rest, and coming from such a position as that which I held, ought to have given General Headquarters in France the widest of warnings. But alas, once again reports were not credited. There was more than one high officer on Sir Douglas Haig's staff who was an optimist, and who fondly imagined that the Germans would allow himself to be fought as and when the Allies pleased. Thus little notice was taken of these reports which came flowing in. The attack had been planned for the piercing of the present front, it was argued, and there the attack must be delivered. It was a very common fault I found in wartime in every staff of every country, but particularly in the British staff at General Headquarters in France, of accepting only such information as happened to fit in with the plans of the particular staff. Anything else was dismissed as untrustworthy or inaccurate. Had the staff learned by their mistakes, one would not have been so disturbed. Actually, perhaps it was fortunate for me that I did not find out until after the war that the greater part of the warnings which I sent over, always at the greatest of risk to my life, were disregarded. Had I known this, I would not have been quite so ready to hazard my neck. Not only on the German side had there been a change in command. It will be recalled that in December 1916, the ever-optimistic Joffre was promoted to the rear, and Nivelle, who had done so well at Verdun, was placed in his high position. Joffre's idea had been that from 1917 onwards the British army must play the greatest part in the war, but Nivelle ridiculed this. The French army was the finest in the world, he declared, and must have the biggest hand in the great and final victory which was now near, except that he was a far better talker than his predecessor. His phrases had the same ring, but his talking meant that he got into the press, perhaps more forcibly than did old Papa Joffre, and as the French papers all found their way to us in Germany, we were able to get some idea of his inclinations. Students and those who followed events at the time will remember that Nivelle was all for the offensive, brusque et brutal. There were to be no nibbling attacks, but one great onslaught, a breakthrough on a vast scale. Well forewarned was forearmed. We agreed at headquarters, which had now been removed to Krasnosh, that the only thing that remained to be confirmed was the locale of this great offensive. Now, a good many of Nivelle's ideas were good. One of them was that the soldiers taking part in a battle ought to know more about it. Then, when their commanders were killed or wounded, they would not be so completely lost and helpless as was often the case. They would understand what they were supposed to do and would go on and do it even without leaders. I personally think the idea an excellent one, infinitely preferring it to the cannon fodder alternative. I agree that it is a highly desirable thing that even a junior, non-commissioned officer should have an intelligent idea as to the course and intention of the battle. But that is a very different thing to handing out indiscriminately complete battle directions in writing. Another of Nivelle's ideas was even sounder. He insisted upon the essential value of surprise. Now, surprise has been one of the biggest factors in victory throughout the whole history of warfare, and no military student will disagree with Nivelle on this point. But nevertheless, you do not get surprise by talking about your scheme with every officer, and particularly with every politician with whom you happen to come in contact. Nevertheless, it was not from this latter source that our first intimation of the scene of attack came. It arrived in such a fashion that it was scarcely believed. In the middle of February 1917, the German Third Army undertook a local operation in Champagne. There was no purpose in this operation except to make a local improvement in the position, for as a result of the Battle of September 1915, the Third Army along this particular sector happened to be holding very unfavorable ground. The attack was successful, and 2 or 3 miles of trenches were captured. The documents taken not only from the bodies of the dead and pockets of prisoners, but from the dugouts, were first sifted at the Third Army headquarters and then sent on to GHQ. One of them, found in a company headquarters dugout, was a remarkable document. It was a divisional order issued by the general officer commanding the 2nd French Infantry Division, dated January 29th, and it pointed with the utmost clarity to a tremendous offensive in the coming April, along the Chemin des Dames front. This was complete news to us, for there had been strong rumors that the attack was to materialize in the hitherto quiet center about Saint-Mihiel and to the south through Lorraine. I was very concerned as I studied this captured order. My first inclination was to argue against its authenticity. I could have said, "This is a blind. The French, anticipating our local attack, have left this document behind solely to mislead us. Therefore, the story in it is a fake. The offensive will not fall on the Chemin des Dames. We must look out on some other front." This would have been quite a feasible argument, and I am fairly confident that even had I not convinced Ludendorff as to its truth, I could have shaken his confidence in accepting the order at its face value. But unfortunately, I was actually stricken with the same doubt myself. Remember that I had never met Nivelle, knew nothing of him except what I had read in the Allied newspapers. His first opinions, as they had filtered through, bowdlerized as they might be in the press, seemed to me to be good ones. I could not think that he would be so suicidal as to adopt methods of this kind. So thinking it over, I persuaded myself that the whole thing was indeed a subterfuge. This Nivelle, I said, is a man after my own heart. Surprise. Yes, the Allies must have surprise. This is one of his methods, an ingenious trick to throw the German command on the wrong scent. So I kept my argument to myself, and even went the other way, accepting the captured order without question, and suggesting the early concentration of reserves behind the Eisen front. How I kicked myself when I found out how wrong I was. But then I could scarcely be expected to understand that the Allied command would use methods which would normally only be conceived in the mind of a congenital idiot. For some weeks, however, I was quite happy. I was convinced that the order was a blind, and saw the German reserves concentrating on what was, I thought, the wrong sector of front. But on April 5th, 1917, I don't know how I concealed my agitation, for during the previous night the Third Army on the same front carried out a raid. Among the prisoners taken was a French sergeant in command of a small post actually in the front line, and in his pocket was found a document which gave the order of battle of all the troops north of the Eisen, and the objective of the various corps in the coming attack. Never were a commander's plans so hopelessly given away. What incredible folly that the plan of battle should be carried in the pocket of a man in the front line, at the mercy of any raiding patrol. Then for the first time I saw my foolishness. This time there could be no mistake, for the preparations for attack were already revealed. It was far too late for me to advance my argument of a blind. The only thing I could hope to do was to stop the proposed offensive. Otherwise, it was obvious that those gallant Frenchmen would be mown down like rabbits by the guns and machine guns waiting for them, knowing their plan almost as well as they did themselves. A few days later, the Belgian Maid near Guildford received another letter. This time it took Mason only a very few minutes to decipher its meaning. It would appear that the Belgian girl had written to her mother in Belgium announcing a possible change of position. This letter was the mother's reply. It forbade the girl to think of moving at all. The whole idea was dangerous, the mother said. She was very well off where she was. Why not stay there, and so on? Oh, no account whatsoever was she to move yet, said her mother, or if she were determined, then she must move somewhere else, never in the direction which she suggested. No, she must never think of moving north. It was most unhealthy. If she wanted to move at all, let it be further to the east. Mason, as I have said, made short work of this. It was very easy for him to deduce that it was the French attack to which I referred, since the English attack was already directed towards the east, while the French were facing directly north along the Eisen. The War Office duly sent off the warning with the usual fate, as I found out afterwards, which attended so many of my messages. Unfortunately, once again, my warning was sent direct to the French General Staff, who thus knew that their plans were completely revealed to the Germans. What did they do? They simply took no notice. They ignored it as an inconvenient fact, not even mentioning it to the French cabinet. Why? Because a commander who had planned a great offensive regards it as a child of his own. It ceases to become a mere plan. It becomes a passion. The more it is opposed, the more it is to be maintained. Any difficulties which may arise must be ignored. Any disagreeable fact must be suppressed, and if further cause for alarm were needed, it was to be found in the fact that Nivelle had not only lost the confidence of his government, but of the very competent generals who were actually serving under him. Yet he persisted, knowing that his subordinate generals were certain that he could not succeed. Fully aware that the Germans knew everything about his plans, this in itself ought to have been enough. He had already seen, during the course of the war, how stubborn was the German defense, even when surprised. What then would it be with ample warning? But he took no notice whatsoever. The French advanced to the attack with their usual gallantry. They responded to the inspiring words of their leader. This was to be the breakthrough, the final great battle of the war, which would drive the Germans back into confusion to the Rhine. They did not know, as they light-heartedly leaped from their trenches, that the Germans knew every detail of the attack. Consequently, by the end of the day, 50,000 gallant Frenchmen lay dead and maimed about the bloodiest of battlefields. The succeeding month was perhaps the most serious of the war to the Allies, for the French soldiers, utterly disgusted at the failure of the high hopes and rash promises of their leaders, refused to carry on with the fight. There were mutinies in dozens of divisions. In some, the men refused to fight at all. In others, they would defend the trenches, but not attack. It was a very strange commentary that the spirit of the poilu, which had never been broken by the fiercest German attack or the most desperate defense, should falter at last before the incredible stupidity of its own commander. It was shortly after this melancholy episode that I made my next and my last visit to England during the war. Such visits were not normally within my province since my transfer to operations, but this was deemed to be a matter of such importance that I was asked to make use of my special capabilities as regards visiting England and to take it in hand. It raises, by the way, an interesting point, the comparative immunity of leaders during warfare. If you will look down the cabinet lists, for example, of all the leading combatant countries, you will find that scarcely a politician concerned suffered any damage throughout the whole of the war. It is, in fact, a stock argument today that if the leaders of the country had to undergo physical danger themselves, they might not be quite so keen on giving their sons and other peoples or of leading their nations into war. Personally, I don't think there is much in the argument. I have met a fair number of political leaders of a good many countries in Europe, and although I could accuse some of them of a good many things, there are very few whom I would charge with being deficient in physical courage. But from time to time, I need hardly say, they were actually in danger, not from the ordinary buffetings of war, but from assassination. how many Englishmen, or more particularly English women, held the view that the Kaiser was the villain of the peace, and that if only he could be bumped off, the war would be soon finished. They marvel that no one was courageous and ingenious enough to find his way into the Kaiser's palace and to execute this man who was rolling Europe in blood. The idea, of course, was quite fallacious because I think I have already said whatever the Kaiser's influence may have been previously, during the war itself, it was almost negligible. Nevertheless, it was an idea, as contemporaries will readily recall, that was very widely held, and it would not have been at all impossible. There would have been no difficulty whatsoever in finding volunteers for such a mission, though it would have brought certain death to the volunteer. The British government did, in fact, receive many such offers, particularly in the early days of the war. Why, then, were they not accepted? The answer is simple. While the removal of the Kaiser might or might not influence the conduct of the war, it would definitely and certainly unite Germany in a way in which she had never before even contemplated. In the resultant horror at such a ghastly deed, after such a calamity, after such a dastardly deed, even the most pacifist among the German people would be utterly and wholeheartedly for the war. Thus it would have been a very bad stroke of business on the part of the British government had they allowed the Kaiser to have been assassinated in such fashion. In the same way, the Germans were tormented by volunteers who wished to murder the principal exponents of the Allied cause. All offers were rejected for precisely the same reason. On both sides, such offers were considered in cold blood, for after all, there was no more reason why the Kaiser should not be killed than any other German soldier. But the Germans turned them down on exactly the same grounds as we did. In the middle of 1917, there arrived at General Headquarters at Krusnoch a suggestion which differed from the rest in that it was obviously put forward by an educated man. The others almost invariably were made by fanatical but ignorant enthusiasts. The letter which he wrote ran to several pages of closely reasoned argument, very logical argument too. He pointed out that in spite of the entry of America, Britain was the greatest of Germany's enemies. If only we could shake Britain to her foundations, then victory would very soon be ours. And he argued for all practical purposes, Britain is now one man, Mr. Lloyd George. Therefore he suggested that he should be commissioned to proceed to England to assassinate Mr. Lloyd George. As I read and studied his appreciation at length, I marveled at its completeness and accuracy. For whatever you may say about Mr. Lloyd George now, and a good many people who hailed him as a marvel in wartime are only too ready to decry him today for caution known even to themselves, you must not only give him credit for what he did during the war, but you must admit that, as this German pointed out, for the last 2 years of the war, at least, Mr. Lloyd George was England. He was in a position of power that had been unequaled by any British statesman throughout the course of history. Put the matter this way, Suppose by an unhappy chance Mr. Lloyd George had been murdered in the summer of 1917. Look around the whole of the statesmen available, and see if you can find a possible substitute who could step into his place and prosecute the war with the same vigor and at the same time carry the country with him. Think of the statesmen of the day: Balfour, Bernard Law, Robert Horne, Curzon, Asquith, and so on. Can you see one of these stepping into Mr. Lloyd George's shoes? I don't think it is possible. During the manpower crisis, scandalous use was sometimes made of that phrase, an indispensable man. But of all the people in England, Mr. Lloyd George surely deserved it the most. As usual, the offer was turned down. The author of the letter received a very polite but formal note informing him that it was quite impossible to take advantage of his suggestion, and instructing him that he must not think in any way of pursuing it further. When I sent off this stock letter, Amur told me that earlier in the war such offers were so frequently received that he had considered the possibility of printing or duplicating a suitable reply. I thought that I had heard the last of the matter, but a fortnight later I was informed, on returning to my office, that a Herr Schleicher was waiting to see me. The name sounded familiar, but is common enough in Germany. But after a minute's conversation with my visitor, I discovered that he was the man who had written such a logical appreciation of the situation, and had volunteered to murder Mr. Lloyd George. I looked at him in some surprise. He did not fit the conventional picture of an assassinator at all. He was a little man, not perky as some little men are, but very meek and mild. I could easily imagine him being bullied by a large and strong-minded wife, but I could not see him taking part in any action which required force, either of character or physique. He would be nearly 50 years of age, I should think, and this, combined with his low physical category, doubtless explained why he was not engaged on any form of military service. He explained that he was totally dissatisfied with the letter he had received. He was convinced that Mr. Lloyd George was the key to the whole opposition front, and if once this key could be removed, that front would collapse. I might even have agreed with him had I spoken my real mind. He demanded to know if there were any further reasons why his suggestion should not be carried out, complaining that he was by no means convinced. I argued with him for some time, and meant every word I said, when I first persuaded but later commanded him to dismiss the whole idea from his mind. I suggested other ways in which he might help his country, for it was obviously a patriotic complex which had him in thrall. This line seemed to be successful, and when he left me, I certainly thought that I had convinced him that the scheme was dangerous and impracticable. So much so that I did not even trouble to report his visit to anyone, or to put him under police supervision. Judge my surprise and concern, therefore, when a week later I received a further letter from him in which he said that he had considered all my arguments, but after pondering them very carefully, he remained convinced that his own suggestion was the best. He quite appreciated it was impossible for General Headquarters or the government to be associated with such a plan, so he proposed to carry it out by himself. Then the German government would be able to plead complete irresponsibility. He had found out a way of reaching England, he said, through the kind offices of a cousin who occupied a consular position in Sweden, and by the time this letter was received, he continued, he hoped to be in England. Within a very few days we should hear that our greatest enemy was no more. There was great consternation in the staff circles. The fool had played right into the enemy hands, they said. Evidently he did not realize what the ramifications of police work meant. Assuming that he did succeed in assassinating Mr. Lloyd George, the English police would without difficulty trace back the method by which he had entered the country, and if they once traced him to the cousin who was a consul, that is to say, a German official in Sweden, well then, it would be absurd for the German government to deny responsibility, for although it would be true, yet not a single person in the whole wide world would believe it. What was to be done? There were obvious objections to direct communication with the British government, although one officer did suggest a warning message via the King of Spain or the Queen of Holland, but he was overruled by higher opinion, which demurred from action which might so easily be misinterpreted. During the conference I saw my late chief, Colonel Nicolai, looking at me. I had been so long with him that I knew what was in his mind. I did not wait to be invited, therefore, but made the suggestion myself that I should hurry to England with all speed and should endeavor to get hold of this idiot Schleicher myself. After all, suppose we did warn the British police of the anticipated attempt, we could only send a description of Schleicher, and there must be thousands of little men answering to that description in England. It is true, he would have been specially remarked as he landed, but his consul cousin would have been able to have given him proper documents, no doubt passing him off as a Swede without great difficulty. I had already discovered in the course of my interview with him that he spoke English with reasonable fluency, and once clear of the interrogation at the English port, well, it ought to be a very easy thing for a little man to lose himself among the 40-odd million inhabitants of England. My only hope, and I must confess that at first my misgivings were not very great, lay in fact that I knew Mr. Lloyd George must be carefully guarded by the Special Service Section of Scotland Yard, whether he wanted it or not. Yet a guard can relax, and Schleicher was such an innocent-looking individual that certainly no one would ever suspect him at sight. So it was agreed, without discussion, that I should get to England as quickly as possible, and should hang about the district where Mr. Lloyd George happened to be. Then I should be sure to see Schleicher as he approached for his attempt, although none of us had the slightest idea by what method he proposed to accomplish the assassination. Once I had discovered him, it would have to be left to my discretion how I dealt with him. If I could bring him back, that would be the best solution. He could be thrown into prison for the remainder of the war, or I could, if circumstances permitted, knock him out. I was promised complete exoneration, even from the charge of murder, if I should kill him in the doing of it, although I pointed out that such exoneration was worth very little, inasmuch as the crime would be committed on British soil. Only in the last emergency was I to denounce him to the British police. Then I myself would have to take my chance. They had a perfect right to arrest me as a prisoner of war, if not as a spy. My only hope was that, having done them such a good turn, they would let me go in return. Even as these suggestions were thrown at me, I propounded a fourth, the possibility of framing up some comparatively minor crime on Schleicher, causing him to be arrested and imprisoned for this. My great difficulty, however, was getting to England. Not that I could not have used my ordinary route through Holland, but this took more than 3 days, whereas Schleicher, according to his note, might already be in England. It was Zwenck of the air staff who came to my assistance. For some months, as I had previously known, the Germans had been experimenting with parachute descents from aeroplanes. These are quite common today, but it is important to realize that 17 years ago they were practically unknown and always a matter of tremendous risk. Zwenck got for me a special parachute which had been evolved but had not yet passed its final test. Although the preliminary trials had been comparatively satisfactory, particularly when the pilot or observer was able to drop from the aeroplane at a considerable height. He suggested, therefore, that I should go to England by aeroplane, which, flying very high, would be able to evade the defences lying about the coast and the fringe of London. Then, at a suitable spot over open country, the pilot would descend to a proper height, and I would jump out of the airplane. The parachute would do the rest. The descent would, of course, be made by night, and I might be unlucky and come down near some habitation or people. In order that I should have a complete story ready, he proposed that I should go over in the uniform of an officer of the British Royal Flying Corps. Then naturally no one would have any suspicion, but on the other hand would be ready to give me any assistance I wanted. I agreed to everything. I was genuinely anxious to get to England as early as possible. I did not share the doubts of some of the others who thought that I would certainly be arrested on arriving in such a fashion. I knew very well that I ran no risk of that. What I was concerned about was that parachute descent. I am a landsman, pure and simple. Even on the sea, I am never tremendously happy, and in the air I am, and always have been, very miserable. Now, in addition to a rather hazardous flight through the night, I was without practice to undertake a parachute descent, and even its godfather did not claim for it that it was anything but risky. But as I would gain at least 48 hours by the adoption of this method, and as this might mean life or death to Mr. Lloyd George, and consequent peril to the British cause, I felt that I ought to take a chance. On one thing I did insist, that if the pilot of the airplane did not receive my signal that I had landed safely, immediately on his return, the alternative suggestion should be implemented. That is, the British government should be informed by the medium of the King of Spain, or some other eminent neutral, of the possible attempt, and a full description of Schleicher be given. An hour later I was at the aerodrome near Krusnosh, climbing into a high-powered bombing machine, which however carried no bombs on this occasion. Previous to this, I had been given the fullest instructions for the use of the parachute. I had only to keep my head for 10 seconds. It was quite enough, and the parachute would do the rest. It sounded simple enough when they explained it to me, but I was to find it a tremendous nerve strain when the actual moment came. I believe that in these days every Air Force pilot is obliged to jump from an airplane and make at least one parachute landing as part of his ordinary training. I don't envy them their job, although of course the methods and devices have been vastly improved since my time. In the early hours of the night, we were over the English coast, flying very high so that it was utterly impossible for us to be spotted. My pilot then began a gradual descent. On the near horizon we could see the shaded lights of London, not the bright yellow glare of peace-time, but a sort of dull red haze which lifted London from its surroundings, for in spite of all lighting restrictions, I can say from experience that it was the easiest thing in the world for a raiding airplane to find London. A quarter of an hour later, the pilot signaled to me that we were at the right height, and I prepared for my ordeal. Nervously, I fingered the straps about me. Would they hold my fairly considerable weight? Would the parachute open? What a miserable death if it failed! I tried to pull myself together. "Steady yourself, you fool," I said to myself. "You've only got to keep your head for 10 seconds. Just jump, count 10, and then pull the cord which opens the parachute. That's all. Just count 10. Nevertheless, could I, in my state of nerves, keep my head long enough to count 10? It sounds easy enough. But to those who may laugh at my fear, I can only recommend that they should try it for themselves, even today. After this lapse of time, I shudder at my fright at that moment. I tried hard to think of protective prayers, yet I was so rattled that no deity could ever have understood my invocations. My pilot, when I saw him weeks afterwards, agreed that I looked very scared as I climbed to the spot which had been shown to me and prepared to drop overboard. Scared was not really a strong enough word. I was tremendously frightened. I am not more nervous than any other man on land, I think, but this was something right out of my line. It must be a nerve-wracking job, even if you are used to it. But to me it was sheer torture. Yet it had to be done. I let go, and immediately began to count 10. It seemed as if I were freezing with horror, as I shot down towards the earth at a terrible pace. I was tremendously tempted to pull the cord, long before I reached 10. At this rate, surely I must hit the ground within 10 seconds. But I waited at least until 9. When I pulled the cord as I had been directed, to my horror I shot down and down. Had the parachute failed to open, my poor brain whirled round and round, and for several seconds I could not experience conscious thought. When my mind at last became rational, I found that I was now tailing down at a comfortable rate. Above me, against the blackness of the sky, I could see a great white ghostly shape. So, like the navvy who fell out of the 9th-story window, I was all right so far. Actually, I was all right all the way, except that I had no idea that the ground was so near, so that when I did land it was with such a bump that I bit my lip and shook myself up severely. However, there I was, very, very thankful and happy to be on solid earth again, and what was more, in England. Hurriedly I unstrapped the parachute, took out my torch, and signaled to the pilot circling round up above. Immediately on receiving my signal, he made off to the south, and I was alone. I had only the faintest idea where I was, somewhere in the middle of a field, certainly, and I could hear the rustling of trees not very far away. The ground was rather hilly, and I guessed from the direction our aeroplane had taken that I must be somewhere about the North Downs. By this time it was very nearly midnight, but I wanted to get to London immediately. I walked on, therefore, through 2 or 3 fields, until at last I came to a farm lane. Following this along, just before I hit a main road, I saw on the bank above me a house of considerable size. There were no lights showing. Everyone had long since gone to bed, but I had no hesitation in knocking the people up. It was the owner of the house who eventually came to the door, wondering what on earth had disturbed his peaceful slumber in this quiet corner of England. I explained to him that I was a Royal Flying Corps officer who had been making an experimental descent by parachute, but unfortunately I had been blown right off my anticipated course and had completely lost touch with the RFC tender which should have met me. Could he therefore tell me where I could get a car, as it was essential that I should go back to London at once to report the result of the test? There was no difficulty about this. The man was of some means, and had a car of his own in the garage. Like most of his class, the English country gentry, he was a man of tremendous patriotic fervor. He had 2 sons in the Navy, and he himself was engaged in administrative war work of some kind in Whitehall. He asked me only to wait while he dressed, and he would drive me up to town himself. Leaving me with a selection of drinks, he went off to put on some clothes. Although I am naturally a very abstemious man, I don't mind confessing that this was one of the few occasions in my life when a stiff tot of whiskey did a tremendous lot to restore my nerves to their normal, steady condition. I had landed near Oxted, I discovered. The road at this time of night was clear. My host knew the way, and in little more than an hour I found myself in Whitehall. He was rather concerned when I asked him to drive direct to Scotland Yard, instead of to the Flying Corps headquarters in the Strand. There I dismissed him, after taking his name in order that he might be thanked for his invaluable assistance at a more suitable time. I had naturally determined to take the special branch of Scotland Yard into my secret immediately. My conversation with the German staff on this subject was mere eyewash. True, I still considered that it was my job to tackle Schleicher, and that I had the best chance of anyone of catching him, but at least I wanted to put Mr. Lloyd George's personal guard on the qui vive. The first man to whom I spoke at Scotland Yard was rather inclined to take no notice of me. I could scarcely blame him, for they received rumors of assassination, or similar reports about 20 times a day. I asked therefore for a telephone call to be put through to Sir Basil Thompson, who was doubtless by this time in bed. He was, but I got through to him, and a few words put matters right. I was to be given every assistance, and full note was to be taken of anything I had to say, and the necessary action taken immediately. First I asked about Schleicher. Had he landed in England yet? All the records received from the ports were examined, but there was no trace of any man answering the descriptions I gave, for naturally he would not attempt to enter England under his own name, but would doubtless take a Swedish patronymic. I asked that instructions should be sent out immediately to all ports, particularly those on the east coast, to keep the sharpest lookout for such a man, arriving from the direction of Sweden. Immediately he arrived, he was to be arrested, and I was to be notified. It will be seen that I had already deviated considerably from the method suggested at General Headquarters, but I was playing for safety. Once I had got Schleicher into my hands, I could easily think out some suitable story that would satisfy GHQ.